Welcome, everyone. I'm Andrée Bober, founding director and curator of Landmarks. I've spoken many times about how art has the power to inspire us, to challenge us, and to help us imagine a better future. And I think Simone Leigh's work is incredibly successful in this way because it emphasizes and it celebrates all of our humanity. And that is especially important in a place that struggled to be equitable, because it opens the potential to bring our community together and to help us move toward a more welcoming and inclusive environment. So thank you for choosing to participate in this talk today and for being part of this celebration. Our event is made possible by many, many dedicated individuals, as well as the foundations and agencies that support our work. I'd especially like to thank the Stillwater Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Texas Commission for the Arts. And for their leadership, I'd like to acknowledge Ross Johnson, Larry Singel, and the Office of the Provost, Project Manager Robert Hengst and PMCS, Landmarks Nisa Barger, who has overseen every aspect of this sculpture's installation and care, our Deputy Director, Kathleen Stimpert, and the entire Landmark staff who have made this program possible, and our moderators today, Dr. Cherise Smith and Dr. Stephanie Sparling Williams, who have lent their guidance and their wisdom and their support at every stage. And we wouldn't be here if it weren't for the absolutely breathtaking work of Simone Leigh. Simone, it is such an honor to have your sculpture grace our campus and to have you share your time with us today. We all look forward to learning from you. So thank you, thank you. And last, I'd like to welcome Dr. Ramón Rivera-Servera, our recently appointed Dean of the College of Fine Arts, who I'm delighted to be working with. Welcome, Ramón.
Thank you, Andrée. As new Dean of COFA, my mission is to ensure that the college is an inclusive, vibrant, and welcoming space for scholarship and practice. And Landmarks certainly models this work by building a public art collection that reflects the many communities that we serve. And it offers pathways to engagement that are free and accessible to all. Sculptures like Sentinel IV, seriously playful in its engagement between the relationship with the object and the body, and between scale and history, help us make connections and offer space for difficult conversations. I'm honored to welcome Simone Leigh and our two distinguished moderators here today. Dr. Cherise Smith, who many of you know has been an agent of change at the university for many years, an art historian who specializes in the politics of identity and race, currently the chair of the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies, and the founding executive director of the art galleries at Black Studies here at UT. And Dr. Stephanie Sparling Williams, a leading Black feminist theorist and curator at Mount Holyoke Museum. She also serves as the project's curatorial contributor and has been instrumental in sharing insights, developing materials, and guiding conversations about Simone Leigh's work. And you can read her essay on Simone Leigh on the Landmarks website, which you'll see linked to your chat right now. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome and those generous introductions. And thank you to the entire Landmarks team and collaborators for making this long-awaited event possible. Congratulations to everyone at UT Austin and the greater Austin community on the acquisition, of this truly stunning sculpture. And thank you all for taking your time out of your Thursday afternoon to gather here to celebrate the installation of Sentinel IV, made by one of the most important artists working in this moment, Simone Leigh. I have the immense privilege of providing an abridged introduction to the artist, only cut short so that we can hear from her directly. I will then pass the microphone on to my brilliant colleague, UT Austin's own Dr. Cherise Smith, who will share a few remarks before launching the three of us into our conversation. Simone Leigh's practice incorporates sculpture, social sculpture, video, installation, and public engagement, which are each informed by her ongoing explorations of Black female identified subjectivity. Leigh works in a mode she describes as autoethnographic, and her objects often employ materials, forms, and aesthetic rhetorics traditionally associated with African art. Her performance-influenced installations create spaces where historical precedent and self-determination commingle. And I borrowed that off of her gallery's website because I just thought that was truly beautiful. Over the past decade, Simone Leigh has used her creative practice as a critical means through which to not only pursue and amplify representations of Black feminine forms, but to also celebrate and serve her primary audience, those who identify as Black women. Drawing upon the quotidian visual traditions across the African continent, American South, and the Caribbean, Leigh's sculptural work in particular engages with diverse Black cultural histories and complex experiences across the diaspora. And I'm really looking forward to discussing some of these very influences that Leigh is drawing upon, particularly in Sentinel IV. Over the course of Leigh's career, explorations of architecture, history, and representations of the Black female figure have catalyzed some of her most profound work, including Loophole of Retreat in 2019 at the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum and Brick House, also in 2019, commissioned for the Highline Plinth in New York City. Each of her pieces is meticulously researched, and this is something I truly admire and enjoy about her work. And the conceptual heft of Leigh's sculpture is only really outdone by the forms themselves, right, which range according to her many influences. And here I just want to give a quick shout out to scholar and cultural theorist Christina Sharp, poet Dion Brand, abolitionist Harriet Jacobs, feminist conceptual artist Lorraine O'Grady, sculptor Nancy Elizabeth Prophet, and African-American studies scholar Sadia Hartman, to name but a few of Leigh's intellectual and creative interlocutors. And to do her numerous accolades justice would surely fill the remainder of our program this evening, so I will just include here a few additional highlights before I pass the mic over. Leigh's work was included in the 2019 Whitney Biennial at the Whitney Museum of Art in New York, and exhibited in important exhibitions at the New Museum of Contemporary Art, at the Tate Exchange as part of Tate Modern in London. And her social sculpture, The Waiting Room, at the New Museum was absolutely transformative, as was her The Free People's Medical Clinic in 2014, which was a project commissioned by Creative Time. And finally, she's presented public installation presented by the Studio Museum in Harlem at Marcus Garvey Park in New York, and a recent solo exhibition at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. Lastly, as many of you are well aware, Leigh will represent the United States in the 59th Venice Biennale in 2022. So we're all looking so forward to that moment when she will represent us on the world's art stage. And also just, again, so privileged to have her here this evening with us in the midst of her preparation for that exhibit. So I'm going to pass the mic off to Cherise. And also, if you have questions as the evening goes on, I just encourage you to throw those in, or to drop those gently in the Q&A, and we'd love to incorporate them at the end. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's my real pleasure and honor to be with you this evening. I want to first thank Landmarks for asking me to participate in this program. It's really been a great pleasure and honor to participate in it. I'd like to also thank Stephanie for allowing me to horn in on and participate in this conversation with her and with Simone. And finally, of course, I'd like to thank Simone Leigh for making this just fantastic work that I am so thrilled to have on campus. So what I'd like to do first is just offer a couple of thoughts. And where I would begin is to say that I have been on the campus of the University of Texas at Austin for about 16 years now in the departments of African and African Diaspora Studies and Art History. And in my time on campus, I have been an advocate for, and I guess a thought leader to bring more art by people of color to campus. I've done that in a couple of ways. First, by creating exhibition spaces, by adding to the curriculum, and also by fostering more representative collections on campus. And so I can truly say that it is both an honor for me and an honor for campus to have Sentinel IV placed on campus. It is really just a high point in my career here at UT and an important and I want to say landmark without making a pun, but it is a landmark object to have on campus, both artistically and politically. So I had the great honor of talking with Simone last week, and there were a few things that we shared. One of them is a background in African art. And so what I know is that we're both interested in how traditional pottery is made and the fantastic forms that they take, as well as the fact that it is often women's work. So those are topics I hope we will talk about today. We are also both interested in supporting the work of other artists, especially artists who identify as women. And Simone has a very deep and honest relationship in how she has been supporting other artists and practitioners, in addition to cultivating performances in which other artists may participate. So I hope that we will also address that. We also talked quite a bit about notions of beauty as they are explored in her work, and I would argue as they are explored also in her self-presentation. If you've had the honor of seeing any portraits of Simone, you see that she always has a very regal and dignified bearing, along with having just fantastically sculptural, well-conceived clothing. And so there's something very considered about her self-presentation that in some ways echoes her artwork. So I hope that we'll get to talk about some of those issues this evening. So at this point, what I would like to do is volley the first question, and I will begin here. Could you please describe your training in pottery and ceramics? Continuing on, could you also describe your relationship to traditional pottery traditions of West and Central Africa, for example? And what are your thoughts on this medium's traditional association with women?
I became an artist via Nigerian pottery. I had discovered a book called Nigerian Pottery and was really obsessed with the forms. And also it was interesting to me conceptually because I start to think about how many objects that are made by women are anonymous. And I started thinking about, unseen labor or unacknowledged labor and also knowledge production amongst Black women. So I took a ceramics class, which also introduced me to some other traditions. But as you can see, I'm still dealing with those same issues now that I was in the beginning via Nigerian pottery.
Could I just follow up with you? I know that you had time at the Smithsonian Museum of African Art and that you have kind of engaged in that milieu and with that art. Its relationship to women's work, and that it has been in some ways both a privileged and sort of outcast cast for women, is also an interesting component. Are you interested in those aspects of traditional pottery?
Yes, very much so. I'm interested in the objects formally, but I'm also interested in the story they tell about labor. So yes, absolutely.
Simone, I was wondering if you could please talk a little bit about actually the physical process of making your work. And do you see this labor, speaking of gendered labor, but do you see your labor is also gendered in this moment and, maybe differently than some of the traditions that you've been researching? And then curious to hear a little bit more about your relationship to clay and clay modeling, specifically how you have shifted your process, or if your process has shifted as the scale of your work has gone from smaller clay-based works to monumental bronzes.
All of my ceramic work, most of it is made through some kind of hand building, usually coil building. And that's the way I started. I've always used the same processes. Sometimes I use molds. For a long time, I used the mold of a watermelon to make these enlarged cowrie shells. And so I usually choose objects because of what they mean. I'm also really interested in a class of artists of objects that maybe clay water pots fall into, which is a kind of material culture where the object is changed by daily use. And so that has led me to be, spend a lot of time thinking about Ibeji dolls and the history of Ibeji dolls in northern Nigeria and how they're used. And these objects, because they are functional, tell a story about the environment that they're placed in or that they function in. So with terracotta, it has this really amazing property where as water evaporates in the terracotta pot, the water that remains becomes more and more purified, and it also remains cool. So that's why you see these kinds of round pots all over the world, because they're so extremely functional. And also, if you're going to place a pot on the ground, then it's much easier to work with a pot that has a round bottom rather than a flat bottom that will just tip over. So all these things about the form are connected to function. And I see that if you go into other objects that are like more classically considered African art objects, those issues still remain. The idea of functionality doesn't like fall out when you start talking about the larger objects. And particularly, I'm interested in the idea of a power object, object that has power, that acts, that's expected to either be a telephone to the ancestors or to manifest something. And so I would describe that as my relationship to, that's the way I've been thinking about objects in sculpture.
Can you talk a little bit?
My first bronze, and I only was able to make that piece because I got the opportunity from the High Line. And when I made that bronze, I learned a lot more about what I wanted to do and what I could do. The shift in scale created a lot of new ideas. And also I realized that I was very comfortable at that scale. Also, I can move much faster in clay modeling for bronze because I don't have to worry about the piece making it through a ceramic experience. I don't have to worry about the wall thickness, the drying times. There's so many things that are considerations and kind of difficult things about building in ceramics that I can totally avoid by clay modeling for bronze. So what that did was it created an ability for me to move faster. So if I have an idea in ceramics, it might take me 6 weeks to see it through to see if it's going to work out or not. Whereas in clay modeling for bronze, I might be able to change the piece in 15 minutes. And speed, I had never paid enough attention to the idea that speed could change my work. So that was a really wonderful discovery.
Simone, I'm super interested in this idea of speed, so I hope that we'll come back to it. But in the short term, I wanted to ask you about this notion of power objects. And one of the things that I found interesting was your talking about how objects are imbued with power with their use, which also means that because they are used, their features may be softened, altered, transformed. Could you talk about that process as it relates to your work?
Well, one of the reasons why I continue to use clay as a medium is because of the different surfaces that I can create in atmospheric firing kilns. I do think that the process of ceramics is very similar to lots of different kinds of identity formation. And even to this day, I'm not really sure what's coming out of the kiln. And I love that like continued lifelong learning. The issue of patina is fraught. Often patina is used as something to create wealth in African art objects. And so I think that people have sort of shied away about talking about it. But with the Abeji dolls, for example, you would, if you have this belief system, you would get a doll when a twin died, and you would continue to take care of that doll maybe for your entire life. I saw Abeji dolls that had been so loved that they had no features anymore, and that their, you know, the color of their clothing had been worn off. Still fascinated with it.
Simone, can you talk a little bit about, when we're thinking about use and power symbols, can you talk a little bit also about the process of making Sentinel IV and its own connection to a kind of material cultural use?
So the object that this sculpture is based on is a spoon that's used in fertility rituals in Southern Africa. It also, this kind of combining the body with a tool is also a grand tradition across West and South Africa, and also East Africa. So I also am engaging in a kind of language, vocabulary by, you know, combining an object with a body. It's also a very classic object. If you had taken even one single African art course, you would know about this spoon. And that's one of the reasons why I chose it as a starting point. I just, from my entire life, have wanted to play around with this object and scale. So I was, you know, it was a dream come true to make this piece, and I'm thrilled that it's at your campus.
Thank you so much. I want to just follow up with, you often discuss your work or describe the process as a kind of autoethnography. And we've talked a little bit about this offline, but I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about this for this audience, about this approach and its significance within your larger practice. And I think it's maybe connected a little bit to how you're coming to some of these objects as well, and your treatment of these objects.
There's a kind of grand tradition in Black feminism of having to do your own research. Like Catherine Dunham, Zora Neale Hurston, Alice Walker. I mean, the list is very long. You know, Catherine Dunham is a great example where she went to University of Chicago and went to grad school as an anthropologist in order to have the tools to go to Haiti to learn dance, and then to bring that back and create like the first, you know, modernist African American dance form. That's a tradition that I'm working in. It's like not something that I made up for myself. It's out of necessity, and also I would say it ties me also to a group of artists that work in the global South that have to do everything, you know, at times be the curator, at times be the fundraiser, as well as being the artist. So I definitely work in a more collaborative Global South mode.
I'm going to switch it up and ask you a question that's following up on what you just said. You mentioned out of ethnography how many Black women artists and other artists from the Global South by necessity have to work in this manner. Could you talk about your fostering, cultivating experiences for other artists? For instance, Lorraine O'Grady, whose work you have both supported in an intellectual way and encouraged community for artists and makers. So yes, could you talk about why you do that work?
Well, I think that I'm part of probably the first generation of Black women artists who have been able to have long careers. And we're all very aware of those before us who weren't given that opportunity. And I also have noticed, because I see myself trying to do this in parenting, where you can kind of be the person you wish you had, and so I really enjoy that, and it becomes kind of healing for you. So I really enjoy that as well. And I don't have a sense of scarcity. I think I work with a group of artists and thinkers like Rashida Brimbrae, where we've been able to have really wonderful careers by opening the gate wider instead of gatekeeping. It's a really effective strategy for getting your ideas into the world, and collaboratives work. I found I used to be very oppressed by the fact that I would have to do so many things attendant with an exhibition where I have to do the wall text and then all the ideation around the work, but then also like public programming and these other things have become like attached to the work of the artists at each museum show. And so my way of making peace with that is to open those platforms as opportunities for other artists and scholars. And it's also necessary because there's so much lack of knowledge around the work. So I feel like I've had to bring, I feel like there's a symbiotic relationship between Black women artists and intellectuals right now that I would like to make more visible. And so that goes to Lorraine, who is, for me, one of the most important artists for me, for my career, for my life, for my, being. And for a lot of reasons, we're so different. She really prioritized concept over form for most of her career. And she wrote Olympia's Maid and really kind of clearly explained what we were kind of going through at the moment. And that was such a useful text for me, and also was so encouraging. It was a delight when I was at the New Museum to start collaborating with Lorraine. And since then, we've done several things together, and including a lot of dinners at a Jamaican restaurant in Brooklyn called The Islands. And so I think also these collaborations are a way of me just improving the quality of my life, because my work is like quite lonely in general.
Thank you for the work you do.
Thank you.
I mean, it is truly social practice work, and not in the kind of theoretical sense of it.
Yeah, thank you. That installation is just great.
I know. I wanted to just highlight that in the background, we are seeing installation shots from the work that went up just a few days ago. So this is the work in situ in the Anahis Gymnasium courtyard, which was specifically designed to house this work. Really exciting. I wanted to also just note that you all can put your questions for Simone in the chat, or not in the chat, excuse me, in the Q&A function. If you would like to ask a question, we're going to be turning to audience questions in about 5 minutes or so. Simone, I'm curious, you had kind of hinted at what it is like to see your work in this university context. Can you talk a little bit more about what it means to be acquired by an institution like the University of Texas in Austin? And what is it like to see your work on the screen installed in this space?
Well, I think, a lot of people don't realize that how difficult it is for a university to acquire a sculpture of this scale. They're really expensive. And also museums. So ironically, the places where you would want the work to live the most are the places that really struggle to, have large collections. But also in general, I think UT Austin is a very interesting university in which, it's located. Well, I guess I have heard that Texas is not considered the South. But for me, it is part of a kind of South American landscape, which I feel equally intrigued by and threatened by. One of the questions that came to me around this installation is, did I feel like the sculpture was safe? And so I'm just starting to understand. It's only been 2 years that I've had works that lived in a public square. And since then we had so much discourse about monuments, especially last year. So I feel like I have a lot of thinking to do about what it means to work in this way, but this is definitely something I'm really proud of.
Can I just say that we here at UT have, like many campuses, been grappling with our, or maybe I should say the institution's relationship to enslaved people and to the slave past, and how founding donors, et cetera, were slave owners and contributed to the university's wealth, for example. And so as objects have been taken down and moved, and real important work has been done by figures like Ted Gordon about the racial and gender geographies on campus, it is just a real coup for the university to have installed and acquired your work, and to have it live here and make a place. So I want to just acknowledge the work that Landmarks has done to grace the campus, but more importantly, Simone, to thank you for making it and for allowing it to be a part of our campus and to make such a bold statement.
Thank you.
Bold and beautiful.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question about these notions of beauty, which I know that you are also and very seriously considering? I mentioned to you that I was intrigued by the project that you engaged with in Garage with the actor Zendaya, who is in clothes that are kind of sculptural, and in relation to your work, very evocative of it. And I've also noted in my opening remarks that your self-presentation is likewise so considered and remarkable, really. It's instructive, I would say.
Wow.
Yeah.
I am really surprised to hear you say that, because I have not been someone who spends a ton of time on her appearance. And I've had to figure out how to deal with more and more visibility. So I have tried, and shout out to Marion, my stylist, to get some kind of armor together. As people do, it's very interesting, the way what people expect an artist to look like, act like, look like. Thank you for liking my dress so much. I have tried to be able to make the transition from studio to talk or studio to gala easier for myself. I work in the studio every day. I have scars all over my body. I usually get at least one scar a day. And so it is really difficult to exist in these two worlds, but it's another one of those things that reminds me of, the anonymous Black women's labor, like we were talking earlier about the amount of mentoring a professor has to do, attendant with just being the Black professor on campus, so thanks.
You're welcome. And I would say, Simone, that it isn't, you do look beautiful in your clothes. So I do want to remark on that, but they are so perfectly aligned with your sculpture and also space making for you. So yes, it's really just a master class in having you called it armature, I think, to do some work for you that separates you out and that also kind of uplifts and puts you on a plinth in some ways.
Wow. I'm going to think about that. But I do take it as a compliment. I am trying. My daughter questioned me about a year and a half ago that she didn't think that my figures were large enough, that some of the women look frail. So I think I am extremely conscious of what it means to put a Black femme body in space. And I'm thinking about it in every single way, all the time. Also, I had another thought, but I just lost it. You guys have these great questions. I feel really overwhelmed to have so many ideas swirling.
We're also peppering you with them, so perhaps a bit of that as well. I did want to draw folks' attention to some conversation going on in the chat that I feel is really rich. Aja has offered that your description just now of style and dressed as armor kind of reminds them of Tracy McMillan Cotton's essay on competence and the way appearance of competence through this kind of styling is relevant to agency and survival, which I think is really a really apt contribution to the conversation. And I think your really decades long explorations of beauty, I think really offer something unique in the form of sculpture, which I think we see so few, I think, of this mode. I think Black women, indeed, scholars, theorists, artists are operating in all of the ways that the complicated, complex, overworked, multiple hat ways. But I think it's so interesting to see sculpture, in this mode, really asserting kind of a Black feminine beauty, right, in presence. I like this term that's being, has been used by Valerie Casal Oliver, this idea of radical presence in Black form. And I think that when I see your work, what was that?
I was in that show.
Yes, no, you're absolutely in that show. And I think that this is really, your work is so perfectly, kind of articulating that radical presence. And I want to, maybe you can just talk a little bit about how an exploration of beauty in the Black female body, kind of got you to a place of kind of asserting radical presence in, in dominating really spaces in the art world, especially in the last like 3 to 5 years.
Well, I had the benefit of being left alone for a long time because figurative sculpture and ceramics were extremely unpopular, if not to be avoided, when I started working. On top of not having a traditional pedigree, on top of being I tried very hard not to be an artist. I thought it was going to be a life of misery. But I just kept on making these objects, and I always had this one more project I wanted to do. So I just kept, I saw myself getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning when I had a newborn, and earlier to get my work done. So I just, at a certain point, realized I wasn't going to stop making this work. And it started with a consideration of the body, labor, and form. And I had a chance to, go in lots of places with that, make lots of mistakes, and, without a lot of limelight around it. And I wish many other artists would have opportunity to make their work without having to immediately do all this other associate labor that an artist has to do, and also deal with the issue of visibility, which can destroy some people's careers, either because of the extreme visibility and the way it can affect your mental health, but also I think it creates, you start to have a dialectic with different audiences that can make you shy about standing your ground. And it's just it's just so much easier for me to make art as a 50-year-old woman. If I was in the same position I am now 20 years ago, I would be really worried for myself. So I think being older and wiser is really useful. And I think also having a lot of time to play and experiment and to work in an environment without a lot of ideas of scarcity and fear is what I was fortunate to have.
Cherise, we have a few questions kind of coming in the chat. Are you okay to transition to some audience questions, or were there other questions that you wanted to ask before we turn it over?
I actually have one last question. I'm sorry, I'm going to ask it really quickly.
Let's ask the question.
How did you come to champion the Black femme body, to use your phraseology? I mean, there are so many ways that people come to the Black body, and it's not always from a place of beauty and care. So yeah, that's my last question.
That's so hard to answer. I mean, I feel like I'm working with a call and response kind of process that Saidiya Hartman calls the chorus, and that I'm actually working with, I'm very affected by the work of scholars like Christina Sharp, and it has changed it does change the way they work. And when I started to read about the concept of critical fabulation, for example, it encouraged me in the same way I was talking about Lorraine's text encouraging me, but it also is a conversation. So let's say that conversation has been, as well as the ongoing conversation with Rashida Bembray, Sharifa Rose Pitts, Nancy Mutiti Kalelo, and my other close collaborators. these are the things that we care about and talk about and deal with all the time.
Stephanie, do you want to go through the Q&A first?
Of course. So this question kind of follows up with what we were just discussing. This is from Tao Lewis, and a friendly name.
Yes.
Excellent. Simone spoke with Saidiya Hartman about collaborations between Black women artists and thinkers, beautifully describing this as a constellation of values, holding and regarding one another whilst making your work. Is this kind of wisdom innate, developed, or both? Anti-patriarchal radical care often feels scarce among young emerging artists.
No, I had the best mentors in the world, and I didn't even realize it at the time. One was Peggy Cooper K-Fritz, and the other was Olabisi Silva. And between the two of them, I was very well trained in having manners as an artist, understanding that an artist isn't one person, but is many people, understanding that Black artists are not going to advance unless we work collectively in some ways. Those are all things that I got from them.
Thank you so much. Another question by Jasmine Wilson has asked a few questions. I'm going to highlight one that really resonates in this particular conversation, and maybe come back to others. Hello, Simone. My name is Jasmine Wilson, and I'm currently writing my master's thesis on African aesthetic symbolism, on the African aesthetic symbolism of your sculpture Brick House. But one of the questions that I think really is interesting, she asked really great questions, but during the time you were left alone, how are you making a living and supporting yourself? I think as a young practitioner, folks would like to know maybe how you were balancing some of these.
I had 17 kinds of hustle. My main job was teaching very young children for Studio in the School, which is an organization that was started with Agnes Gund, and which places artists in school environments so that we can sort of counteract the really kind of poor training that kids get in art classes these days. So that was a regular gig. At one point I read books for reading is fundamental. I did try to work for other artists, and I found that too difficult to be making someone else's work and try not to think about my own work. I worked at a photo agency for a couple of years, but I would say my main job was teaching young children, because then I was on my daughter's schedule. When she was out of school, I was out of work.
Thank you for sharing that experience. The second question that I think is really interesting, and maybe taking it a little bit more towards her research interest, is where the title to Brick House kind of emerged. She's interested in wondering if it was inspired by the song, which I don't think it was, but maybe correct me if I was, the Commodore's song, where the title comes from. And also if you could talk a little bit more about your interest in the architecture and the tradition that informed that piece specifically.
It's interesting, it hasn't come up in this conversation, but I have been very loud about describing my primary audience as being Black women, or as maybe myself. And there is no Black culture that I have visited where people don't know what a brick house is. I think that is, I don't know, I actually may not have the language to describe what kind of word that is, but I think I like the way it operates, and I like the way it privileges strength and fierceness as a feminine quality, as opposed to weakness and fragility. And that's where it came from. I sometimes regret naming the sculpture Brick House because of the Commodore song. You know, this is a sculpture that really worked out for me in a lot of ways. So I don't know. I still have a little bit mixed feelings about it because I'm just not sure how it translates sometimes, the title.
Could you share a little bit more about the architectural reference and kind of your influence with that?
The body of that sculpture, and I often my sculptures are kind of creolization or creolized form. So I'll have a jug that might be referring to a face jug made in South Carolina in the 1800s, combined with a human body that's in a kind of Western style, you know, posed. And there's lots of combining of different objects and forms from different times. I like the way I can kind of collapse time in sculpture. So for a very long time, I have been obsessed with the 1931 fair, Paris exposition, which was kind of a reenactment of colonialism while it was still happening, which had really elaborate pavilions that just became hybrid because they became collaborations between architects from various countries and French architects. And it also is really the birth of negritude. Senghor started negritude in 1930. And also the Surrealists protested that exhibition. And we know that like Suzanne and Aimé Césaire were a part of that Surrealist group. And also I noticed that there is, whether it's the Free People's Medical Clinic or the use of the spoon, there's a kind of method of reenactment that I use in various ways that's influenced me. But that particular building, that's the house or the body of Brick House, is a kind of architecture called Musgoum, that you find these kinds of structures in Cameroon. They're not made as much anymore, but they're quite beautiful, and they became a really important part about this exhibition. And Stephen Nelson wrote a book on those forms, and I've been obsessed with them. If you look back, you'll see that form show up repeatedly in the work.
Excellent, thank you. I think we have time for just one more question. So I'm going to kind of package two folks' questions into one. I hope that's okay. A question from Ariel Jackson and Madison Cooper.
Oh, hi, Ariel. Ariel is a fantastic artist.
So two artists would like to hear from you. Ariel is asking, how have you been balancing the level of production and self-care? And then Madison Cooper asked, as a Black female artist, I find myself having a difficult time incorporating identity in my own experience within my work in a way that isn't so opaque. Do you have any words of wisdom for going about this in sculpture or art in general? So a question about production and self-care, and another about identity working through sculpture in your art process.
And the second artist was Madison Cooper?
Madison Cooper.
Okay. With self-care, I was really fortunate that when I came to New York, I had a few friends that didn't have jobs, but they had houses and they were spending all day taking care of themselves in the houses. I had never known that this was even a thing. Like I was really shocked at how busy they were. And I realized that, I was just very aware of self-care as something that was really important and something that you needed to make room for, and also something that not enough Black women had availed themselves to. And I feel like at this point we have seen the results when you see the amount of maternal death that we're still dealing with. I believe a woman was actually studying, working on this problem of maternal death and then died herself recently. Do you remember that story, Cherise? I think she was working for the Centers of Disease Control. Anyway,
I don't.
So we have seen like what has happened, and that was something that was really discussed a lot in the Waiting Room magazine that I created, attendant with the Free People's Medical Clinic. Also, the purpose of that project, which was a curation of Rivera-Servera, was to show a lot of the ways in which we have figured out how to take care of each other and ourselves. So it's always been a focus of mine. I also had many conversations with my friend Chitra Ganesh about this all the time. I think protecting your mental health is probably, in the top 3 subject matters of what I talk about all the time with my friends, especially other artists. And then Cooper's, which question did I answer?
The last question was really if you have any advice for another, someone who identifies as a Black female artist, for kind of tapping into identity or personal experience in your work. Let me see if I can go back to that question.
Well, why does she feel she has to?
That's a great question. I was
if you're a Black woman, it doesn't mean that your work has to be at all interested in identity,
Yeah.
It just
So
be
going about, Yeah.
I think she should give herself permission to not be interested in identity.
I love that. Permission granted.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Simone. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I think the Landmarks folks want to come back on and just send you off for the evening, but I just really appreciate your generosity and your time this evening, both Cherise and Simone.